Okay, so this is the third lecture in chapter 1, still on the sociological perspective. And the first two video lectures we talked about, I've really just been talking about the sociological perspective and the sociological imagination. In this one, so here we pick up with the third slide. We are just cruising, right? Pick up the third slide, and this is really just a list of all the different, like if I was doing a promotional video or something and I wanted to make a plug for why sociology was good, I might use some of this stuff. I mean, it's certainly about moving beyond yourself, right? Because there's really not a self. I mean, there is a self, but anyway, it's about moving beyond your personal experiences, your self-knowledge, because we're talking about the relationship between the personal or the individual and society. We're going to be looking at how our personal decisions are influenced by social forces. I like to use the example of, like on the very, very hot day, why do we bother to wear clothes? Because social forces tell us we must. Or when you're in a big rush and you stand there patiently and you wait in line at the grocery store, why don't we just walk out? Because social forces tell us we must, right? And really that suggests that nothing that we do, that we are constantly following social rules, that we're really not guided by our own personal, again, there's no such thing as the individual, right? And then it also gives us some insight into how, if we want to change the world, if we want things to change, offers some strategies as to how we do that. And, just spoiler alert, we got to work together. Basically, one person can get things started. One drop can overflow the bucket, but you got to have a whole bucket in there before you, right? Take the global perspective. And again, that's about thinking beyond ourselves, noticing where our food comes from, noticing where our clothing comes from, noticing what part of the world, how many resources I use relative to other people. Tolerance, now this one right here, this pearl here, promote understanding and tolerance. In some of the literature that I read, I do some reading in the anti-racism movement, and they actually argue we need to move beyond tolerance. Because if you think about it, when somebody says, "Oh, well, I just tolerate you," that's not exactly accepting you, right? To tolerate you is still sort of not treating you like a fully engaged person. So we even want to move beyond that. We want to move to acceptance and integration. Evaluate good and bad. So this is sort of a tricky use of word here. There is an effort from a sociological perspective to be value free. In other words, to look at social patterns without a bias. Now, that is challenging to do because we're all social creatures and we all come with our own bias, but there is this effort, I think, amongst social scientists to really just look objectively at things that are happening and try to explain them. A good example might be some of the events that have happened last week in Washington at the Capitol building, right? Different people feel very strongly about it, but if I am being a purely sociological observer, I look at what happened there and I can see all the social theories, and I can see a lot of sociological explanation going back to this triangle. When a whole bunch of people act in the same way, they can create change, right? If I'm going to evaluate it from a good or a bad perspective, I might say, well, that was a bad way to try to do it. Well, I tell you what, history says that that's one of the ways that we create change, right? So it's really looking at patterns there, but there does sort of come a point where even a sociologist, if I'm even being just an academic, where I say, that it would be considered not a desirable outcome. And usually that outcome is somewhere where people are denied fully actualization, or they're denied access to social resources. So policies are just policies, right? Patterns are just patterns until we begin to inflict harm on people. And so that might be a reason that if we looked at what's happened in Washington, we might say, oh, I don't know, you started to inflict harm. On the other hand, we could say, well, the people that acted collectively felt like harm was already being inflicted upon them. Well, then you could also argue that the people that acted collectively really were not the people being harmed. What they were angry about was that folks that used to experience more harm, right? So the observation that collectively, if we were to just look at the numbers and just look at the patterns, the people who were acting collectively were mostly white men, right? And so from a sociological let's look again perspective, one might say, well, why were there not people of color there? What is the different, how do different people experience, um, how do different people see that, different groups see those patterns differently? And certainly when we're seeing pictures of Black Lives Matter paired up next to pictures of the, I don't know what word to use, but the masses on Washington, you see those strikingly different images. And that would be using our sociological perspective and our sociological imagination, and then trying to understand why were these people treated, why were those images so different. So evaluate good and bad. I've already talked about this. See that things are not necessarily what they appear, what we think we see, right? So I can stand on my back porch and I can look at that blue sky. And so it may look to me like the sky is blue, but in reality, it's a really cloudy sky because because I can't see the whole sky. So what I can see is, right? And the question or the challenge is that may be what it looks like from my perspective, but that may not be what it looks like if I get a bigger picture. Another example I think of is if you go snow skiing, right? The mountain may look different at the bottom than it does at the top. It's the same mountain, right? And it may not look so scary at the bottom as it does at the top, or in reverse, right? Or that cliff may not seem so steep until you get right up to the edge of it. So things change, right? And how we explain them. And then this last one, connect your personal troubles. I think this to me is probably what is so empowering about the sociological perspective, and probably what led me to love it, what led me to go, that is my perspective, is when we're struggling, and in my case, I was a young person and I was having some, some growing pains. And it was sociology that helped me understand why I was experiencing the world this way, or gave me a different way of thinking about it. Instead of me seeing what was my life as it was one, all bad, or that it was all my fault, I began to understand that it was much bigger than me. And maybe that's the best way to think about sociology, or the sociological perspective, is it's a perspective that's bigger than you. And it's a perspective that's bigger than one person or one group's perspective. And it asks you to look at it differently, to look at what we think we see differently. I think I'm going to stop right here. Well, it's pretty early. No, I'll tell you what, I'll keep going. This slide, because I'll just sort of brush this one with big strokes. This slide is would be the history of sociology. And while I may think it's interesting, my experience is students don't necessarily find it the most interesting of stuff. But a couple important things that explain sort of the origin of the discipline, so to speak, is that it emerges out of a time in human history. First of all, it emerges out of a time of some rapid social change. We have political change happening, right, where the French Revolution, and the French, I couldn't help but think about the French Revolution while you're watching all these news stories, because that's exactly what happened in France. Is the masses, the masses marched on the castle and they started beheading people, right? And it led to it because the masses were angry at the leadership. They were angry at royalty, and they created change. They created social change. It was a very rapid and a very disruptive change, and that's what revolutions are about. They're about rapid destructive changes. We also had a revolution, the American Revolution. It was a little different, but it was violent, and it was about changing the relationship between the American colonists and England. It was disruptive. It cost a lot of people their lives and a lot of people money. It was violent, and it led to some really, so, you know, while 4th of July is considered a holiday, in the United States, it's considered a day of grief and grieving in England, right? And then you have the Industrial Revolution, which was also a period of rapid change. There was a lot of violence, a lot of violence, a lot of people lost their lives, a lot of pollution, but it was a rapid change about how people lived their lives and how people organized resources and met their needs. Some have argued we're in a technological revolution right now, that technology is changing so rapidly that it's disrupting or it's reorganizing our lives so quickly. And that's sort of what characterizes. But you also have knowledge and the way knowledge is being created, right? So you have what's referred to as positivism, and positivism is sort of a intellectual period where no longer are we listening to, you know, the priests who are telling us how the world is, but people are creating their own knowledge, right? People are collecting and measuring and drawing their own conclusions without the church telling them. You have some rapid human movement around the globe. So there's a lot of, we're thinking differently, we're thinking differently about relationships to authority, the structures of our life are different, and out of this emerges a handful of thinkers that are trying to explain it, right? That are trying to explain the way the world is. And you get some of our founding people, which is going to be on the next slide. This is the only chapter where we talk about people. Okay, so I will stop right here.